Chapter 10, Inoculations PT. 1. The motive: false mortality/morbidity attribution, authorizations of dangerous drugs/treatments, and suppression of safe, effective, early treatments. With these things we should now have a clear picture of the means and opportunity which can be attributed to the public health criminals responsible for the COVID crimes against humanity. But why did they do this? The answer, as I will go on to explain in the following chapters, is several-fold. The truth is that many people benefited from this orchestrated disaster, and those who did had a variety of things to gain from it. As far as public health departments go, however, there is one clear, overarching motive. It is the one which is least subject to conjecture. They confess to it openly beforehand. It is also at least tangentially related to pretty much all the others, so I would consider it the most relevant. The motive I'm talking about is, of course, the inoculations. The Milken Institute confession to act in harmony toward a common end. The definition of conspire, per Merriam-Webster 1, by the very definition of the word, there did exist an open conspiracy to sell the world on mRNA vaccines, which had never before been used in humans. This conspiracy was made public during an October 29, 2019 meeting at the Milken Institute mere weeks before the alleged outbreak was meant to have begun. 2. The meeting was streamed on C-SPAN and featured government health officials such as Anthony Fauci and Rick Bright. The topic: a universal flu vaccine. The first speaker to highlight is Michael Specter, who was identified as a staff writer for The New Yorker. Why don't we blow the system up? I mean, obviously we can't just turn off the spigot on the system we have and then say, hey, everyone in the world should get this new vaccine we haven't given to anyone yet. But there must be some way, my emphasis, that we grow vaccines mostly in eggs the way we did in 1947. In Specter's own words, the goal this Milken Institute conspiracy he was a part of hoped to achieve was to blow up the traditional system of vaccines in favor of this new vaccine. As we will see, the new vaccine technology he is referring to is mRNA. While Specter is not a public health official, it would be extremely reasonable, if not necessary, to question the possibility of his objectivity in subsequent pieces on the matter. Such objectivity would be extraordinarily important during a time when people are being presented with information on whether or not to inject themselves with a substance never before used widely in humans. However, not only did The New Yorker not question this glaring conflict in one of its primary science-related contributors, it published Specter's subsequent promotion pieces on the mRNA inoculations. Once, some way, to blow up the system, came. One example is his November 16, 2020 piece titled, "Trump is Right, Andrew Cuomo Should Accept F.D.A." Approval of a coronavirus vaccine, which is without question an article for which Specter would have an exceptional conflict of interest. 3. And perhaps nothing illustrates the significance of this better than the simple fact that The New Yorker, a magazine so opposed to Trump that it still considers the man's presidency an active crime scene, on this one issue claimed Trump was right. For in all seriousness though, Specter is the perfect example of how rife these conflicts are between the media presenting the information and the public health officials with which they openly collaborate. Anthony Fauci is, of course, one of those officials, and his comments at the Milken Institute alongside Specter were predictably corrupt. In order to make the transition from getting out of the tried and true egg growing, which we know gives results which can be beneficial, we've done well with that, to something that has to be much better. You have to prove that this works, my emphasis, and then you have to go through all of the clinical trials, phase 1s, phase 2s, phase 3s, and then show that the particular product is gonna be good over a period of years. That alone, if it works perfectly, is gonna take a decade. So we really do have a problem with how the world perceives influenza, and it's gonna be very difficult to change that, unless you do it from within and say, I don't care what your perception is, we're gonna address the problem in a disruptive way and in an iterative way, my emphasis. Because you do need both. Pretend for a second there was no COVID era and the above wasn't the direct confession it is, given this man executed exactly what he described only 5 or so months later. Anthony Fauci, in his own words, does not believe he is obligated to prove that what he is trying to sell people works. When considering the life and death implications of this comment alone and his blatant disregard for those implications, it is without question that this man exhibits the behavior of a psychopath. Fauci doesn't even stop at whether or not it works though. Despite the fact that these mRNA shots have never been used widely in humans, he somehow believes it's acceptable to not only try to convince everyone in the world to take them, without any caveat, he also calls for the historical process of completing safety trials to simply be skipped. Could there possibly be a time where safety trials would be more necessary? Of course not. And this recklessness was contrasted very well by long-time vaccine developer and Australian University professor Nikolai Petrovsky, during a speech he gave in late 2015, and we have a situation where we have some very new technologies in their infancy, and that is the mRNA vaccines and the adenoviral vector vaccines, which are the only ones which you're being forced to have, or certainly, some of us are being forced to have to remain in employment. And the question around what level of confidence do we have that they have been through the usual process, which is usually 10 to 15 years of rigorous testing in, just thousands of people. Now, those thousands of people accept the risk, because they're in a clinical trial, they're given a very extensive warning, this could kill you, this could maim you, and they still sign up and agree to that process, and then they're followed for 5, 10, 15 years. And if they survive and there are no terrible occurrences, then regulators will look at all of that data and approve the product. Now, that hasn't happened in this situation, which is really a first. And so, we all have to sit back and say, well, should then everyone who gets these vaccines be signing an informed consent form, as if they're in a clinical trial? Now my personal perspective is, first, no harm, and 2, the principles of informed consent. We have the Nuremberg Code, the Nazis didn't take informed consent, and as a consequence a number of them were executed after the war for war crimes, my emphasis. And so where you have a situation, yes, you may accelerate things and develop a vaccine very rapidly, and it's still, there's uncertainties, but then you have to tell people the honest truth. I can't tell you whether in 10 years there will be a side effect of an mRNA vaccine or there won't be. No one can, maybe God can, if you believe in him. But in truth, no scientist can. And so if they can't, how can they mandate something which has that level of uncertainty around it? You have to get informed consent, my emphasis. But Fauci isn't concerned about informed consent or safety. And the only reason he gives for skipping this process, which ensures a genocide isn't committed, is that it will take a decade, otherwise. Consider now the common phrase, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Some might argue Fauci's sped-up timeline to hell might come with good intentions. There is no support for this at all, however. Since he doesn't think it necessary to even demonstrate the usefulness of this product, it cannot be said that he's concerned about the potential lives lost in the absence of it. Is the idea that he just believes it will work? Okay, then what is that belief based on, and why should anyone be required to trust in it? Status quo mortality deaths are unavoidable, and obviously don't justify the informed consent violations, aka crimes against humanity, Fauci openly advocates for here. That said, the only possible reason this timeline would be a problem to Fauci is his age and assumed proximity to retirement. To make matters worse, these COVID mRNA inoculations have had by far the worst outcomes of seemingly any inoculations ever. And this paints a much darker picture about the intention behind these comments, which we will touch on in a bit. To finish with how this quote ties to the alleged COVID pandemic though, Fauci flat out declares how the world perceives influenza to be a problem, and says he doesn't care what your perception is, because he's gonna address the problem in a disruptive way and an iterative way. The concept of flurona and the data manipulation previously discussed points strongly to COVID being the disruptive solution created to solve this problem. Further support for this hypothesis has been provided in January 2022, as the idea of an annual flu/COVID mRNA shot combo have been floated by both Fauci and the media as a way to increase flu shot uptake, the exact goal of the Milken Institute conspiracy. 6,7 Fauci's Milken quote also demonstrates a historically unprecedented, tyrannical narcissism in the name of an unscientific science, which is as wicked as it is absurd. Not only does no human being on earth have the type of authority Fauci is saying he's simply going to commandeer, the idea it should be given to someone on a global scale for the first time in history without any proof of concept is both evil and silly. It's not as silly, however, as the idea Fauci would be capable of saving the human race from symptoms as regular and necessary to a healthy body as the cold/influenza, if only every single person did what he said. And all of this might be surprising if it did not come from a man unashamed to advertise a home office filled with several pictures, and even a bobble head of himself. 8. But this is what Fauci is, a silly little megalomaniac and a salesman who has taken one too many deals with the devil. Fauci was far too public with this plot, and he executed it so in line with his pre-COVID comments that pre-meditation is indisputable. As the head of NIAID for the past 40 or so years, Fauci had the means, thanks to his conflicts of interest with both the Moderna vaccine itself and billionaire medical tycoon Bill Gates, more on both in a bit. He had the motive, and with the arrival of mRNA technology, he had the opportunity, an opportunity that now, familiar liar and BARDA director Rick Bright seemed practically giddy to announce at the same Milken Institute meeting alongside him. There might be a need, or even an urgent call, for an entity of excitement out there that's completely disruptive, that's not beholden to bureaucratic strings and processes. But it is not too crazy to think that an outbreak of a novel avian virus could occur in China somewhere. We could get the RNA sequence from that, my emphasis, beam it to a number of regional centers if not local, if not in your home at some point, and print those vaccines on a patch and self-administer. Unfortunately for Rick Bright, what actually happened here is too crazy to think, for a mind not clouded by narcissism. This is because what happened is that a powerful figure theorized a disruptive justification to sell a new, unprecedented drug. This figure, who happens to now be in a prominent position at the Rockefeller Foundation, more on why that's extremely relevant later, would then see his theory come true in the form of an alleged once in a century pandemic within a month of his theorizing it amongst other powerful figures. 9. And as if it wasn't already completely impossible for this pandemic to have occurred in nature, given the timing of all this theorizing, which it is impossible, this figure's theory would occur within a month, in the very country he predicted it would. He would then go on to aggressively, and in his official capacity, slander alternative treatments to the mRNA inoculations he set out to sell from before the alleged outbreak, he theorized, as we saw him do with HCQ. The organizations of which Bright was both a part of and ran tangentially alongside also just so happened to act the following year in unprecedented ways. Take, for one example, the CDC's assertion of jurisdiction over private residential leases. The bureaucratic strings and processes, which make this type of economic upheaval illegal for the worse than useless CDC, are the very same Bright cheered for them to disrupt only months prior. This hysterical, illegal action even ultimately empowered the CDC to theorize green zones, with which to relocate, vaguely, defined, high-risk individuals, in settings which they claimed would necessitate, strict adherence to protocol. 10. The organization actually admits, in the same document they present the idea, that the concentration of high-risk individuals in this prison-like setting could actually present a greater danger to this population. But again, thanks to Bright, we know their goal was disruption, as opposed to logic, human rights, or respecting the bounds of their authority. Bright also elaborates on the mRNA technology itself, highlighting future and current application goals, including inoculations in the form of a patch and the ability to beam mRNA sequences to those patches in one's own home. And don't get me wrong here, there's nothing inherently wrong with futuristic health technology. The problem, again, is the way in which these authority figures scheme to make these things universal/mandatory, and then executed on that scheme. Also, given their complete disregard for privacy and human rights, the technology itself does actually present serious issues related to those topics. We will touch on those later as well. What we can observe here, though, is a group of public health officials who devised a plan. Within a month of their planning, the exact circumstances arose with which they could execute this plan. Each possessed the means, motive, and opportunity to have been responsible for those circumstances. Acting in concert, as they clearly were both before and after, allowed them to amplify their already significant authority and capabilities. Actions they were responsible for during 2020 including false testing, counting, treatment suppression, lockdowns, mask measures, etc. would then directly frame the very narrative they needed to achieve the goal of their conspiracy. Their culpability seems pretty cut and dry at this point to me thanks to this confession, but there is also plenty more evidence to support it. Event 201. We touched briefly on the Event 201 pandemic simulation held on October 18, 2019 in our chapter on censorship. In that chapter we saw how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation explicitly called for censorship in its Event 201 concluding recommendations, as well as for a flood of the airwaves with what public health officials deem factual information. As we've seen with almost every single directive public health officials gave during the COVID era, their grasp on what is factual was not even respected by scientists and physicians in many cases, of whom tens of thousands personally signed their names to multiple opposition declarations. But the simple fact that Event 201's pandemic simulation even occurred in October 2019, immediately prior to the once, in a century event it simulated a coordinated government/media response to, is a truly unbelievable thing, and by that I mean it's literally not believable, even less so when considering it's happening alongside the Milken Institute meeting. So what was Event 201 and who was involved? In the words of its own organizers, Event 201 was a 3.5-hour pandemic tabletop exercise that simulated a series of dramatic, scenario-based facilitated discussions, confronting difficult, true-to-life dilemmas associated with response to a hypothetical, but scientifically plausible, pandemic. 11. The cited purpose of this simulation was a growing number of epidemic events. According to these organizers, unnamed experts agreed that it is only a matter of time before one of these epidemics becomes global, a pandemic with potentially catastrophic consequences. The simulation was sponsored, organized, and recommendations were given jointly by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the World Economic Forum, WEF, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The following is a transcript of simulated news coverage describing Event 201's coronavirus pandemic scenario 12. Narrator, a new coronavirus. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild, flu-like signs, to severe pneumonia. Broadcaster, in related news, a significant demand for personal protective equipment, like 95 masks and gloves, are on the rise. Patients are overwhelming healthcare facilities. People are avoiding public spaces out of fear of infection and in compliance with public health recommendations. RU.S. affiliate has just released polling results on public expectations for a vaccine, and 65% of those polled are eager to take the vaccine, even if it's experimental. My emphasis. Doctor, I'm not optimistic on having the vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic. Public health official, presumably, with enough money and political will, anything is possible. Government official, penalties have been put in place for spreading harmful falsehoods, including arrests. Pundit, if the solution means controlling and reducing access to information, I think it's the right choice. News contributor, what exactly are the risks and benefits of staying home from work? Absolutely, we need to save lives. But we literally cannot afford a heavy-handed response that suffocates our economy. Narrator, the world saw large-scale protests and in some places riots. This led to violent crackdowns in some countries and even martial law. The public lost trust in their respective administrations. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. My emphasis. If you feel that you could vomit from this psychological warfare predictive programming, you are not alone. With introspection, I realize that this entire book is fulfilling the prophecy set forth in the final lines of this dystopian propaganda. I not only do not trust these institutions, but I believe there to be ample evidence they are guilty of crimes against humanity. The solace I get despite this comes from the following: faith in God. I know I am searching for the truth in this pursuit, which is all that matters. The apparent solutions of the Event 201 conspirators on this matter are the opposite of my own on this third point. It would seem most likely, based on the words and history of Event 201's conspirators, that they believe the only solution for this type of thing is global coordination. Perhaps it is possible they wanted to sabotage trust in national organizations like the FDA, NIH, and CDC, in the hopes that people would come running to the more reasonable WHO. I don't have any definitive proof of that beyond the fact that they anticipated the outcome, however, so I will not focus on it here. I also would find it laughable if this actually was a goal, considering the equal, if not more, significant culpability of the WHO, relative to the others. But as I stated previously, there are many players with many motives, and this may or may not be one of them, based on the repeated focus on globalism. What's more important to our purposes in this chapter, though, is the clearly intentional seed planted about experimental vaccines, and the predictive programming study about the eagerness of people to take it. As told by Michael Specter at the Milken Institute, the traditional method of vaccine production has been around since 1947. Therefore, for Event 201 to call the anticipated vaccines experimental implies a foreknowledge that the focus during such an event would be on the experimental mRNA inoculations, as opposed to traditional vaccine development. And whether or not they would even admit they were referencing mRNA shots specifically, this coverage and the event itself also demonstrates that they completely dismiss the possibility of any sufficient treatment beyond inoculations. No mention is made of any treatment at all in the skit above. One would think this would be a focus during such a scenario, but it wasn't, not in the simulation, or in the actual, alleged pandemic. This alignment of the Event 201 response with the actual response suggests a relationship which does exist between Gates, the WHO, the WEF, and the various players on the national level like Fauci and Bright. These conflicts of interest will be discussed soon. But again, for Event 201 to have taken place when it did, with the content it featured, and for it to have done so right alongside the Milken Institute meeting, It continues to rule out the possibility of the alleged pandemic being a natural occurrence, whether or not a novel coronavirus is actually part of the equation. Tying the two together, Gates, Fauci, and the decade of vaccines 20 years ago when we created these new multilateral organizations Gavi for the vaccines, Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria, we didn't know they'd be successful. We've gone through lots of challenges about making sure the money gets there, making sure the efficiency is right. But as we look at upcoming replenishments for those, and we've got so much distractions politically that the international needs like this could get eclipsed if we're not careful, we see a phenomenal track record. It's been $100 billion overall that the world's put in. Our foundation is a bit more than $10 billion. But we feel that there's been over a 20-1 return. So if you just look at the economic benefits, that's a pretty strong number compared to anything else, my emphasis. Bill Gates 13 In January of 2010, Bill and Melinda Gates used the World Economic Forum at Davos to announce a $10 billion commitment to research and develop vaccines, kicking off what he called the Decade of Vaccines, per researcher James Corbett. 14 The WHO corroborates the story in their Review and Lessons Learned document on the program, in which they also refer to it specifically as a collaboration between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the WHO, and Anthony Fauci's NIAID. 15 In this document they repeatedly make clear and track progress toward the goal of a global immunization strategy, namely, a world in which all individuals and communities enjoy lives free from vaccine-preventable disease. While one might find this an innocent enough goal, the primary point here is the clear-cut connection it establishes between all the major players of both Event 201 and the Milken Institute meeting, namely, Gates, Fauci, the WEF, the WHO, and NIAID. In fact, Fauci is even listed as being on the Leadership Council of the Decade of Vaccines collaboration on the official Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation announcement of the program. 16 Even without all the context we now have on Fauci's plethora of conflicts, the very nature of this simultaneously held position on a global collaboration is curious when considering his status as the director of a U.S. national health organization. For example, one of the high-level recommendations in the aforementioned WHO review is a key focus on countries where vaccine uptake is low. How exactly is it within the purview or authority of the director of NIAID to be leading such an effort? Whatever the case, this relationship between Gates and Fauci has clearly blossomed over the years, as CNBC now reports the two talk regularly. 17 Gates even mentions in the quote above the same type of distractions from inoculations which Fauci loathed and announced his desire to address, with or without popular support. The Decade of Vaccines also reinforces the major players' stated goal of inoculating the entire world, which, as we can see from Gates's quote above, is not simply an innocent, philanthropic pursuit. In fact, the goal if met would effectively serve as a perpetual worldwide tax for the magnate and the pharmaceutical companies he supports in these efforts. The more vaccines are introduced into national immunization programs around the world, as James Corbett points out, is the Gates-founded Global Vaccine Alliance Gavi's mission statement, the higher the tax pocketed by Gates and his partners. And the benefit of the service received for the tax is also highly debatable, as for one example even ABC acknowledged in 2019 that more polio cases are now vaccine-caused than otherwise. 18 The debate on vaccines in general is, of course, not a debate to be had in this book, as it would take us off the primary topic of the COVID era and perhaps double, or more, the length. However, there does exist plenty of precedent for the idea this is about more than health for Gates and his collaborators. The following are several examples which occurred during the Decade of Vaccines, as reported by James Corbett. 19. The Decade of Vaccines kicked off with an HPV vaccine study in India which, according to a government investigation, violated the human rights of the study participants with gross violations of consent, and failed to properly report adverse events after the deaths of 7 girls involved were reported. A parliamentary investigation concluded that the Gates-funded Program for Appropriate Technology in Health, PATH, which ran the study, had been engaged in a scheme to help ensure healthy markets for pharmaceutical companies GlaxoSmithKline and Merck, the manufacturers of the vaccines in the trial. To quote the investigation findings, had PATH been successful in getting the HPV vaccine included in the universal immunization program of the concerned countries, this would have generated windfall profit for the manufacturers, by way of automatic sale, year after year, without any promotional or marketing expenses. It is well known that once introduced into the immunization program, it becomes politically impossible to stop any vaccination. Samirun Nundy, editor emeritus of the National Medical Journal of India, is quoted as saying, "This is an obvious case where Indians were used as guinea pigs." In 2016, the steering group of India's National Health Mission blasted the Indian government for allowing the country's National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, NTAGI, the primary government vaccine advisory group, to be effectively purchased by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One steerage group member commented, "The NTAGI Secretariat has been moved out of the government's health ministry to the Office of Public Health Foundation of India, and the 32 staff members in that secretariat draw their salaries from the BMGF Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation." There is a clear conflict of interest. On one hand, the BMGF funds the secretariat, that is the highest decision-making body in vaccines, and, on the other, it partners with the pharma industry in Gavi. This is unacceptable. In 2017, the government responded by cutting all financial ties between the advisory group and the foundation. The Gates founded and funded meningitis vaccine project led to between 40 and 500 children suffering from seizures and convulsions and eventually becoming paralyzed. Internal memo by WHO Malaria Chief, Dr. Arita Kochi, complaining that Gates' influence meant that the world's leading malaria scientists are now locked up in a cartel, with their own research funding being linked to those of others within the group, and that the foundation was stifling debate on the best ways to treat and combat malaria, prioritizing only those methods that relied on new technology or developing new drugs. Several conflicts between the government policy pushing Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the pharmaceutical industry have existed over the course of its existence as well. Corbett points out one last interesting note on Corbett's coverage of these issues, is that the majority of link sources lead to broken web pages, which must be searched for in website archiving platforms. This is yet another interesting note on Gates' determination to control the narrative behind his operations and his influence over the media, to whom Mint Press reports he's funded to the tune of at least $300 million. 21. To demonstrate how this reckless philosophy translated into the COVID era, take the following Fox interview from Gates on April 5, 2022. "I was very glad that those models are out there. Dr. Fauci is doing a very good job of saying the numbers are what count here, and the various models that we, Imperial University, do show that without this dramatic behavior change you could even get worse than that. But I do think that if we get the testing fixed, if we get all 50 states involved, we'll be below that mortality projection. Of course, we'll pay a huge economic price to achieve that. It is fair to say things won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world, my emphasis. And so, the best people at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're all about high-volume vaccines. In early April of 2020, it was not remotely fair to say that the only way back to normal was a vaccine. At that point in time in the alleged pandemic, only a person with an agenda would exclude the possibilities of either a repurposed treatment proving effective, natural immunity being achieved, the illness otherwise receding as SARS-1 is claimed to have, or the models being wildly inaccurate. Gates having done so implicates him for his role in the suppression that did happen of those possible outcomes. As we've already covered, there were effective repurposed treatments, as we will cover soon, there is evidence of post-illness immunity, and we also already touched on how wildly inaccurate the very model Gates cites here by Imperial College London, which his foundation has provided tens of millions in funding to, has proved to be, along with its prescriptions. 23 is mentioning Fauci in relation to supporting those garbage in, garbage out models, is also particularly fitting. These two figures jointly used their tremendous influence to push for the most damaging of policies across the board, policies which accepted only one possible outcome in favor of their objective, and at the direct, documented expense of public health. The history of SARS inoculations and mRNA gene therapies. Since SARS-CoV-1 was initially alleged to have broken out in the early 2000s, there have been several attempts to develop SARS inoculations. These attempts sought to create a neutralizing antibody response by introducing the spike protein of the virus. One example was in 2004, when a modified vaccinia virus Ankara-based recombinant, RMVA, vaccine expressing the spike protein was tested on ferrets. 24 This experiment found that vaccination with RMVA expressing SARS-CoV spike protein actually caused enhanced hepatitis. A similarly poor result came from a 2012 experiment, in which various SARS inoculations were tested in mice, including a virus-like particle vaccine, an inactivated whole virus vaccine, and an rDNA-produced spike protein inoculation. 25 All inoculations led to the occurrence of Th2-type immunopathology, suggesting hypersensitivity to SARS-CoV components was induced. The conclusion was that caution in proceeding to application of a SARS-CoV vaccine in humans is indicated. Let me repeat that with emphasis: hypersensitivity to SARS-CoV components was induced, and caution in proceeding to application of a SARS-CoV vaccine in humans was indicated. Again, this second study was published in 2012, and there do not appear to be any published studies attempting SARS inoculations since. While past studies did not test mRNA gene therapy inoculations specifically, they did attempt to induce immunity by introducing the spike protein meant to be a component of the coronavirus. The claimed objective of the new inoculations is to introduce synthetic messenger RNA, mRNA, to the body, which then teaches the cells to make copies of the spike protein. 26 Seeing as this is obviously the same type of strategy, only with a different spike protein delivery method, there's no reason the past studies wouldn't be an extremely relevant precedent on the capability of neutralizing the alleged SARS virus through that route. Therefore, for the caution in proceeding to application of a SARS-CoV vaccine in humans recommendation to have gone unheeded given this background is criminal. And even without this relevant SARS inoculation background, I would repeat as many times as I can that mRNA is a new, experimental technology. Per Nature magazine, its history of development is long and complex, starting with the discovery of its potential use case in 1987 by Dr. Robert Malone. 27 But for the 2 decades following this discovery there were many struggles and doubts about a possible, affordable use case. Things came to a head in the 2010s, however, which was a decade that saw increased investment, including from the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in 2012. It was during this decade that lipid nanoparticles were determined to be a potential mRNA delivery system. Delivery to the cells was previously one of the biggest roadblocks, since the immune system would otherwise reject the package containing the synthetic mRNA. This sequence of events, the decades-long ramp-up and eventual breakthrough of a technology, would be a fascinating history if not for the ominous way in which it was built up directly into the perfect storm of demand, a demand which otherwise wouldn't have existed. And it is in this lack of demand that we can find the real reason Fauci viewed the world's perception of influenza as a problem, namely, because it hindered his stated goal of universal mRNA flu inoculations. This previous lack of and need for demand is also admitted by the pharmaceutical industry itself, perhaps no better than in a speech by Bayer executive Stefan Ulrich at the World Health Summit in the fall of 2128. We are really taking that leap to drive innovation. Us as a company, Bayer in cell and gene therapies, ultimately the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take a gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body? We probably would have had a 95% refusal rate, my emphasis. As a demonstration of just how coordinated media, pharmaceutical, and public health interests have become, this extraordinary truth drop was actually removed from YouTube. 29. This removal came despite the fact that it took place at a conference with the very authoritative public health voices, Tedros Ghebreyesus of the WHO and Rick Bright, for example, who fancied themselves the arbiters of accurate information. 30. At the same time, it's not surprising at all why evidence of this statement would demand erasure, considering what it reveals. The first thing, which we have been discussing, is that Ulrich admits the overwhelming majority of the demand billions of people worth would not have existed without the alleged pandemic. The COVID era presented a perfect problem, reaction, solution scenario, as presented famously in the Hegelian dialectic, with which the world could be sold on this product that had just a few years earlier became possible to sell. 31. As Nature highlighted in The Tangled History of mRNA Vaccines, this propaganda trick worked with resounding success, with global sales of these products expected to top $50 billion in 2021 alone. 32. But in this quote, Ulrich reveals something else perhaps even more troubling to the cause of the medical/economic oligarchs, namely, the mRNA vaccines are not vaccines at all, but are better described as gene therapies. And this is why, as you might have noticed, I do not refer to them as vaccines in this book. To explain, we need simply refer to the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of vaccine, as of 201,933, a preparation of killed microorganisms, living attenuated organisms, or living fully virulent organisms that is administered to produce or artificially increase immunity to a particular disease. We can contrast this with the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of vaccine in 2022, which is significantly different. 34, a preparation that is administered, as by injection, to stimulate the body's immune response against a specific infectious agent or disease. The entire idea of a vaccine is that the virus itself, in a killed or whole form, is presented to the immune system so that it may be recognized upon future presentation and handled without the onset of illness. This is not the case with mRNA shots, which do not contain the virus itself and are said to fundamentally reprogram the cell to do a process it otherwise wouldn't do, namely, to create copies of the spike protein allegedly specific to the virus. While both focus on creating an immune response, to equate the two is false and is nothing more than a marketing ploy, as Ehrlich effectively admits. And even when fact-checked, the truth that mRNA inoculations are more accurately described as gene-related therapies cannot be avoided. In an article by Reuters titled, Fact Check, mRNA vaccines are distinct from gene therapy, which alters recipients' genes, one of the first things said by the primary virologist source Reuters cites is the following. 35, as mRNA is genetic material, mRNA vaccines can be looked at as a genetic-based therapy, my emphasis. They go on to say that these inoculations are not actually gene therapies, though, because they do not literally alter a person's genetic code, as gene therapies do. Science is ever evolving, however, so despite Reuters' propagandist objective to establish a narrative, the very real concern that mRNA could impact a person's DNA has since been confirmed by a February 2022 study by Alden et al. in Current Issues in Molecular Biology. 36. This study found that Pfizer's inoculation can be reverse transcribed to DNA, and this may give rise the concern if inoculation, derived DNA may be integrated into the host genome and affect the integrity of genomic DNA, which may potentially mediate genotoxic side effects. My emphasis. Images in a separate study submitted by Pfizer itself to the Australian government have also supported this gene alteration according to some scientists, as they seem to show the spike protein entering the nucleus. 3738 But Reuters also ignores one simpler point here, which is the fact that the very argument it makes can be used the same way against it. For example, let's say I was either deranged or corrupt and wanted to make a fact-check blog. If that were the case, I could make an article titled, Fact Check, mRNA inoculations are distinct from vaccines, which contain attenuated or whole viruses, and it would be just as true. But, of course, there's a reason these fact checks only go out of their way to play semantics in one slanted direction every single time, and it's because there isn't as much money in opposing a $50 billion per year industry as there is in shilling for it. Again though, if it can be said that mRNA inoculations are not gene therapies, because they do not alter genes, it can also be said that they are not vaccines, because they do not contain the virus in question. And this might seem like a pointless debate to attempt. However, it is relevant, because of the very specific reason the medical oligarchs refuse to adjust the definition of gene therapy to include the very similar genetic-based therapy, but are willing to reach further in adjusting the definition of vaccine to include what is described by their own sources as a genetic-based therapy. This game of changing definitions to suit agendas gets way worse as it relates to the Public Health Organization definitions too, but we will get to that later. Another issue with the use of the term vaccine as a definition is that these shots are now widely accepted to not prevent infection or transmission, another thing we will go into in tons of detail on in the next chapter. What's important for now though is that the history of both SARS inoculations and mRNA inoculations pointed to a need for caution as it related to any use in humans. Not only was the opposite of caution practiced when the time came to bring the two together, those in positions of authority preemptively plotted what would need to happen to excuse their complete lack of any caution at all. Then, a month later, it happened. The NIH claims ownership of the Moderna inoculation. Yes, you read that correctly. In October of 2019, Anthony Fauci, the face of U.S. infectious disease response for decades and the director of NIAID, a division of the NIH, theorized at the Milken Institute a way in which mRNA inoculations could both skip safety and efficacy trials, and also garner universal demand. But not only did this incredible situation occur without questions raised by the media on the astounding conflicts of interest this implies Fauci had the answers to those questions were provided by the media as matter of fact, despite confirming the worst fears any honest observer would have had, namely, the NIH, and by extension Fauci, had a direct, substantial financial stake in one of the primary mRNA inoculation candidates Fauci was so intent on selling to the public. Unknown to most, the scandal of the century, which was presented as a milk toast morning read, was reported by Axios as early on as June of 2020.39. The should have been earth-shattering headline on the unmitigated corruption of U.S. public health read, the NIH claims joint ownership of Moderna's coronavirus vaccine. Instead of focusing on the underlying conflicts, however, Axios predictably shilled, telling readers why it matters, as, because the federal government has an actual stake in this vaccine, it could try to make the vaccine a free or low-cost public good with wide distribution, if the product turns out to be safe and effective. This propagandist's description completely perverts the real nature of the situation, however. First of all, the federal government's massive stake in the vaccine incentivizes its sale to the public rather than its safety or its efficacy in the ending of the pandemic, if there actually was one. This is as evident in Fauci's alleged pandemic rhetoric, as it is in the relentless efforts to both get everyone inoculated and to suppress alternative, superior treatments during the alleged pandemic. In fact, things got so absurd and on the nose in this regard that the U.S. Treasury Deputy Secretary, obviously not a health official at all, admitted in October 2021, the reality is that the only way we're going to get to a place where we work through the supply chain issues transition is if everyone in America and everyone around the world gets vaccinated. 40. We will go way more in depth on the macroeconomic forces behind the COVID era in a later chapter. But the Treasury Deputy Secretary's sentiments were echoed by Joe Biden as well, who infamously said his patience is wearing thin with inoculated Americans. 41. The issue isn't just with the impact on the health of Americans though, either. The government invested massive amounts of taxpayer funding in the deal to be a part owner of these inoculations. That taxpayer funding means the inoculations are not then free once they are received by the public, but are rather the payout of an investment the public itself made, willingly or not. The obvious problem with this is that in order for the government to make the taxpayers, money back on its investment, it now has a perverse incentive to push the inoculation whether it's good for, or wanted by, people or not. And since the inoculation is falsely, and intentionally, referred to as a vaccine, the government can attempt to justify coercing it. This is thanks to the implication of herd immunity, which is assumed to result from vaccines. Herd immunity can be exploited whether or not there's any evidence it can be achieved, in the name of the public good, just like the production of the shots were justified the same way, whether it was to end up being true or not. Lost in this incredible scheme is the rights of the individual, who had no say in either the initial investment or the informed consent violations that came from the false scenario created to justify them. Criminals like Fauci, the highest paid government official for a reason, profit at the expense of those individuals. As hard to believe as it must be that there could be more, or at this point, perhaps it's expected it gets even worse. Axios goes on to point out that while the NIH and Moderna have done joint research in the past, it was only in December of 2019 that the NIH signed a contract with Moderna stating the following: 42 mRNA coronavirus vaccine candidates are developed and jointly owned. My emphasis. Again, despite the fact that Axios acknowledges this contract was signed before the new virus had been sequenced, they fail to mention a far more important point. According to ABC News, the official timeline of events says the WHO only claimed to have first been informed of the first cases of a mysterious pneumonia in Wuhan on December 31, 2019.43. Indeed, the WHO confirms this timeline of events, and claims that Chinese authorities didn't determine that the outbreak was caused by a novel coronavirus until January 9 of 2020.44. This means the NIH/Moderna part ownership contract for coronavirus mRNA inoculations came a few weeks before the alleged pandemic was even first identified. As if premeditation could be more of a certainty at this point, NIAID and Moderna also shared this mRNA coronavirus inoculation in a material transfer agreement, MTA, with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Ralph Baric on December 12, 2019.45, and this was a particularly telling deal, considering allegations of Fauci's NIAID funding Baric's own gain of function research, yet another troubling detail we will cover later. Axios goes on to point out that 4 NIH scientists had filed for a provisional patent application entitled 2019 nCoV vaccine, according to disclosures in a pending scientific paper. 46. And the kicker? While Moderna scientists co-authored the paper, none were listed as vaccine co-inventors. Axios also quotes health and law policy researcher Zain Rizvi as confirming, the vaccine would not exist without the intellectual contributions of federal scientists. This presents incredible conflicts of interest also due to documented policies which allow those NIH scientists to collect up to $150,000 per year in royalties on their work, per Janice Hopkins 10 in the BMJ. 4710 documented how exploiting such policies had been a common practice of the NIH for decades. Meanwhile, Axios ends its article by suggesting that developers aren't likely to seek big profits from the shots. While this report was from June 2020, prior to the distribution of the shots, one still has to laugh and wonder whether this was either incredible naivete, or just more shilling, given the histories of both the pharmaceutical industry and the regulatory agencies it's captured, including the NIH. What the NIH specifically takes credit for creating is the stabilized coronavirus spike proteins for the development of vaccines against coronaviruses, including SARS-CoV-2, my emphasis. This stunning admission came in an official NIH statement made to Axios on the subject. 48 What it makes clear, yet again, is that the spike proteins being produced by the shot are not specific to the alleged SARS-CoV-2. This admission also implies the alleged discovery of the novel coronavirus was immaterial to the development of the inoculations, which is just another detail beyond the litany I've already covered that, in my opinion, brings into question the claim that there is a SARS-CoV-2 at all. It also follows that this indistinct spike protein must be what's produced by all the different inoculation companies as well, unless they would like to admit they're all producing something different in the body. Additional proof of the inoculation's lack of specificity to the allegedly novel virus comes from the timeline of events related to Christian Drossen's PCR protocol. The paper on that protocol was published on January 25, 2020 and included a theoretical virus sequence provided by the Chinese, as we've covered. You will recall, they used this in silico sequence because they admitted they had no isolate available at this time. Understanding the situation as it was at that time, consider the following timeline of events Fauci provided in a March 19, 2020 interview with Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. 49. So what happened is that as soon as we got the sequence of the virus from the Chinese, we pulled it out from the public database and stuck the gene into a vaccine platform and worked on it literally within a day of when it came out. 65 days later, namely 2 days ago, we gave the first injection to a normal volunteer for a phase 1 trial to see if it's safe. Let's take stock of these dates Fauci provides. 2 days before this interview would have been March 17, 2020, and 65 days before that would have been January 12, 2020. So Fauci is claiming that the shots were developed based on a January 12, 2020 sequence, shared by the Chinese. However, this sequence had to have been the same one being used by Drossen in his PCR report, considering the timing. This makes it clear that the inoculations must have also been developed based on a theoretical virus sequence, as opposed to the alleged novel coronavirus. So even if the alleged novel coronavirus was later isolated and proven to exist at all, that virus cannot have been what was used to develop the inoculations, given Fauci's timeline and the impossibility of the theoretical matching the actual. Again, this lends further support to the idea that the inoculations were simply developed beforehand and the allegation of a novel virus was just a narrative to justify their mass use. The only possible explanation otherwise is if the theoretical virus had matched the actual thing 100%. Since such a match is impossible by chance, the only possible explanation would have been the Chinese having had access to the virus beforehand. This would prove the gain of function theory correct and would implicate both the Chinese and US governments in their having collaborated on this project. However, I tend to doubt this possibility because I've never heard anyone, even the non-mainstream scientists who do believe the novel virus theory, suggest that the theoretical was in 100% match with what they believe to be the actual, now, sequenced genome. So this is one reason I tend to doubt the novel virus theory myself, but I will provide significant coverage on the gain of function theory and its support in a later chapter. Back to the NIH, Moderna deal. At this point it's hard to see the US government as being one distinct from private industry at all. And one only has to understand a few things about the company Moderna's history to understand just how indistinct from the government it really is. In September 2016, the national biotech reporter for the medical media company STAT wrote a lengthy exposé on the ego, ambition, and turmoil plaguing Moderna, referred to as one of biotech's most secretive startups. 50. The story goes on to explain how Moderna CEO Stefan Bancel created an environment which was loath to publish its work in Science or Nature, but enthusiastic to herald its potential on CNBC or CNN. Former employees, of which there were many, the company hemorrhaged, allegedly due to Bancel's ego and lack of any medical or scientific background, charged that Bancel was actually running an investment firm, and then hoping it also develops a drug that's successful. The company lost all manner of employees too at the time of the STAT article, including executives, 2 heads of chemistry, its chief scientific officer, its head of manufacturing, its head of cancer research, its head of research and development, a significant loss as far as a pharma company's future outlook is concerned, and its head of rare disease research. Several of these departures came after periods of less than 18 months on the job. This because prior to 2020, the company never developed a successful drug and was one of the least transparent of any in the industry in sharing any kind of data or trial information. And the story as it related to the COVID era gets even more troubling too. As recently now as January 2017, STAT again reported on Moderna, highlighting a serious problem with the same mRNA delivery system used in the COVID inoculations of today. 51. This problem would present such an issue that a former employee explained solving it would require a miraculous, Hail Mary sort of save. The problem with this lipid nanoparticle delivery system was that with too small a dose, there wouldn't be enough protein produced to make a difference. With too high a dose, however, the drug would be too toxic for patients. Because of this, Moderna pored over medical literature for diseases that might be treated with very small amounts of additional protein. Unfortunately for them, the list of such diseases was very, very short. One project in the works by the company for such a disease called Crigler-Najjar still proved to fail too, with whistleblowers ultimately decrying safety issues. Despite this, Hail Mary dilemma and a company history that STAT aptly points out rivals the corruption of infamous pharma fraud therenos, Moderna is now claimed to have developed an inoculation which does somehow solve this toxicity problem. Not only that though, it's meant to have done so for a disease as historically challenging to immunize against as SARS. Thanks to Anthony Fauci and the strategy of emergency use authorizations, however, no solution to this very recent problem need be demonstrated at all. In fact, Fauci and Bancel seem to make a great team at the head of this company/government abomination, as Fauci too clearly prefers media appearances over scientific demonstration and evidence. But are we really to believe this toxicity problem was actually solved? We will soon demonstrate pretty thoroughly that it must not have been. But even before we get to the damage we now know has been done upon inoculating the population, we can simply observe that the Moderna mRNA inoculations inject 40 trillion packages of mRNA per dose, each of which instructing cells to produce a multiple of spike protein. 52. Now, obviously I do not have a reference for how to quantify, too high, a dose of lipid, nanoparticle, delivered mRNA, instructed protein production, as it relates to the STAT article highlighting Moderna's dilemma. But are we to believe 40 trillion packages times the production per package is to be considered a moderate amount somewhere between too little, no effect, and too much, toxic? Of course not, at Least not without the type of demonstration Fauci isn't willing to provide, and the FDA has requested courts allow it 50 to 100 years before being required to share. 53. Also, besides the quantity issue in general, what about the spike protein itself? Is it a good thing to have the body producing in such massive quantities, which it naturally would not do? Well, it sure doesn't seem like it to me, at least, considering the role scientists claim it plays in people who do get sick. According to News Medical Life Sciences, for example, a 2021 paper by Lay et al. Published in Circulation Research shows conclusively that the spike protein damages vascular endothelial cells, in the absence of the alleged virus, by binding to ACE2 and disrupting its molecular signal to the mitochondria, causing it to become damaged. 54,55 News Medical points out that the dangers of the spike protein itself had been shown in previous studies as well. So, given the damage the spike protein causes on its own, and the seemingly tremendous, unnatural production of this spike protein by the inoculations, alongside the historical problems with both lipid nanoparticle-delivered mRNA quantities and with SARS inoculations in general, how can these inoculations possibly not have come with tremendous risk warnings? Corruption is the only valid response. And corruption there most certainly was. The perfect storm of corruption, EUAs and liability protection. On March 17, 2020, the US DHHS issued a declaration to provide liability immunity for activities related to medical countermeasures against COVID-19. 56. This declaration was authorized under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, PrEP Act, an authorization which is meant to prevent a stifling of innovation. The obvious problem with this policy is that it has accompanied the following: the Moderna shot is a joint creation of the liability immunized company and the government granting that liability immunity. The shots have also been granted EUA authorizations by the FDA, allowing them to skip the standard, decade-long efficacy and safety trials, for an indefinite period of time thanks to the PrEP Act. 57. The illegal economic, social, and physical coercions which have occurred related to these liability, immunized products, more on this to come. The blatant lack of informed consent related to these EUA granted inoculations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration's, OSHA, sudden, inexplicable suspension of its vaccine workplace injury reporting requirement once inoculations were in distribution, more on this to come. To summarize where we've come at this point, in October 2019 Anthony Fauci, among others, publicly planned a scheme, alongside a coordinated pandemic war game, to sell the world on a universal mRNA inoculation without having to prove it works. This mRNA vaccine was a product of the labor of scientists in his organization within the federal government, funded for years by taxpayer dollars, and supported by a demand which didn't exist. Despite this, the product was falsely marketed to the public as the private innovation of a failing company, supported in the heat of the moment by Donald Trump's Operation Warp Speed, to sudden, impossible success. Little did the public know, however, the groundwork for this Operation Trump takes credit for initiating in response to the alleged COVID pandemic was actually signed by Trump himself via executive order in September 2019, just before the Milken Institute gathering. 58. Take a look and see if the language of EO 13887 sounds familiar. Vaccination is the most effective defense against influenza. Despite recommendations by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, that nearly every American should receive the influenza vaccine annually, however, seasonal influenza vaccination levels in the United States have currently reached only about 45% of CDC goals. Most influenza vaccines are made in chicken eggs, using a 70-year-old process that requires months-long production timelines, limiting their utility for pandemic control. Because the market does not sufficiently reward speed, and because a pandemic has the potential to overwhelm or compromise essential government functions, including defense and homeland security, the government must take action to promote faster and more scalable manufacturing platforms. This order directs actions to support the promotion of increased influenza vaccine immunization across recommended populations. Innovative, faster, and more scalable technologies, including cell-based and recombinant vaccine manufacturing, evaluate incentives for the development and production of vaccines by private manufacturers and public-private partnerships, including, in emergency situations, the transfer of technology to public-private partnerships. Complaints about low inoculation rates, replacing the egg model, speed as the first priority over safety, cell-based inoculation technology and disruptive public-private cooperation. It's simply uncanny. Donald Trump must have had as serious a passion on the subject as Fauci himself to have written this. Whether the man who now gets booed for selling out to pharma interests knew what he was signing here or not, Trump's warp speed pre-planning executive order and its timing undoubtedly implicates him in the conspiracy. 59 Perhaps he was convinced to sign it, and his having done so was ultimately held over him as leverage by those he should have opposed. On the other hand, maybe he was fully aware of what was to come and had his role to play in it. Either way, the shameless hawking of the inoculations by Grandpa Moderna makes a lot more sense in this context. The truth of the executive order, warp speed, and the inoculations themselves is that the military's fingerprints seem to be everywhere, as we saw with the heavy investment of DARPA in mRNA technology. DARPA itself is the research and development wing of the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD. As covered by Nicholas Florko of Stat News in September 2020, the DoD also just happened to have a majority role in Trump's $10 billion Operation Warp Speed. 60 In fact, according to Florko, roughly 60 of the 90 leaders on the Warp Speed organizational chart were military officials, including at least 4 generals. The remainder were from DHHS, which you will recall is the organization responsible for authorizing inoculation, injury liability protection. It is worth wondering why there were twice as many military officials as civilian scientists involved in such a group. And this provides additional context to the true nature of the NIH-Moderna relationship. This company, Moderna, the federal government hid behind to paint a picture of private, spur-of-the-moment innovation had never brought a product to market previously, due to toxicity issues. Still, in a demonstration of Fauci's willingness to be transparent in his corruption, he publicly talked up Moderna anyway, as early as January of 2020.61. Once the product was released, Fauci and the government he serves as a salesman for then went on to illegally coerce it without informed consent via economic and psychological control. They did this despite its emergency use status and extraordinary risks, and as they did it they shielded the front companies, aka themselves, from liability to any damages. There are no claims or theories in the above. It is all documented history. Anthony Fauci is a criminal in his own words, as are those tangential to him who support his directives. At the same time, Fauci is not the devil himself, he is but a slave to his appetites. There are other players in this game who know this about Fauci, so he serves as an ideal, controllable figurehead for them. We will cover the other legs of this spider in a future chapter. For now though, we have demonstrated the means, motive, and opportunity associated with the most observable objective and overall scheme of the coveted crimes against humanity, inoculations. In the following chapters, we will discuss the outcomes and impacts of that objective.